This is recorded and live streamed to the world, so you're not going to be in the pictures. So don't be disappointed, but your privacy will not be violated. So the non-combatants, and the rules safe enough to prevent serious injury to the greatest extent reasonably practical in physical sports and demanding sports. What would those games be like without rules generally acceptable to the players, given the known and accepted risks? What would those games be like without referees or umpires and means to enforce, remedy, and deter violations? What would those games be like for the players, fans, coaches, management, owners, and other stakeholders supporting those teams and those sports if 5 of 200 teams had weapons to destroy or threaten to destroy the other team and their fans and stakeholders? What if, in addition to that, those other 195 teams are denied, unless they do what they are told to do, by any one of the 5 dominant teams with the rights to those weapons? What if each one of those same 5 teams can veto any referee or umpire decision because they disagree with it? Why? For the selfish benefit of the dominance of their team, not in good faith, not for justice, and not for the benefit of all. What if there's no appeal or any effective timely accountability to the fans and the human race for such exercise of veto powers? So what do you feel? What do you feel when you hear this injustice? What do you feel? What would you feel in a football game or a hockey game if those kinds of situations? Would you even go to the hockey game? Would you have any enjoyment of watching that? Would you have any enjoyment participating in it, being a stakeholder in it? So, what else do you feel? You feel the short-sightedness of this, the stupidity of it, the unreasonableness of it, and how outrageous it is. Yet these are the global rules of law on earth today. It is why we have wars, violent aggression, war crimes, apartheid, genocide, ecocide, and a growing universal civil society outrage and feelings of injustice about the unjust world order we are witnessing every day on mainstream and truth-telling independent media. It is why we cannot prevent these mass atrocities. It is why nuclear weapons, climate change, and other threats and risks to the human race's survival and flourishing are allowed. So what do we need for global justice, security, and sustainable peace? And I'm going to suggest, let's start with values such as Indigenous ones we in Canada are increasingly embracing and the global human family needs: truth, honesty, wisdom, humility, courage, respect, and a decision to love everybody. Everybody. So I'm now going to ask Kyle to turn over the next comments before we get into the heavy-duty nitty-gritty, which Ernest Thiessen and I will do a duet about after Kauser's introduction and greeting. And then we will have a panel discussion led by former Minister of the Crown, Rochelle Squires, MLA for Riel, until her retirement into the afterlife of being a politician in Manitoba which means you fall into the good graces automatically as a member of the former MLAs Association. Welcome, Rochelle. And that panel will consist of these wonderful people sitting in front of me, Dr. Ernest Thiessen, and never forget, he, like so many of us, me and my wife Brenda, has supported incredibly well and positively and with love a decision to love by his wife Vange, who is here with him. Two incredible people. And Dr. John Guilfoyle, who is here from Ontario, a leader, a doctor, someone that's not unfamiliar with Manitoba, and Rose Ali and her mother is here as a Rotarian, as I am, to witness her daughter performing. She'll be introduced by Rochelle more fulsomely in a moment. I now turn it over to Kyle. Would you please put on the video of greeting and introduction from Dr. Kauser Ahmed. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, esteemed colleagues, young leaders, and friends. It is an immense privilege to stand before you today at the Youth Nuclear Peace Summit, an event that brings together bright minds and passionate hearts committed to building a future free from the looming threat of nuclear weapons. We gather not only to confront this existential challenge, but also to explore the power of law, justice, and cooperation in achieving global peace. Today marks the formal inauguration of Rules of Law on Earth initiative, a project driven by the conviction that the rule of law must be the cornerstone of any sustainable peace. In the face of global conflicts and unprecedented security challenges, including the ever-present threat of nuclear catastrophe, we recognize that traditional state-centric approaches to conflict resolution are inadequate. What is needed is a transformative global effort, a collaborative approach that brings together diverse stakeholders and empowers communities to foster justice, equality, and resilience under the law. Our vision is nothing short of ambitious. We envision a world where the rule of law is universally upheld, where justice prevails over injustice, and where peace is not just an aspiration but a lived reality for all people everywhere. It is a vision of a world where the scales of justice are balanced, where the rule of law binds all nations and leaders to their responsibilities, and where humanity is united by a shared commitment of peace. But vision alone is not enough. As we inaugurate the Rules of Law on Earth initiative today, we must also reflect on our mission. Our mission is to build a global coalition composed of legal professionals, scholars, advocates, retired civil servants, and concerned global citizens dedicated to ensuring that the rule of law serves as the backbone of peace. We seek to uphold truth, protect individual rights, and preserve the integrity of our justice systems through active and engaged global citizenship. The audience, this vision is not abstract. It manifests in practical actions ranging from research and policy advocacy to public awareness campaigns and international collaboration. Through these actions, we aim to create a ripple effect, influencing national and international policy, empowering communities, and raising awareness about the critical role the rule of law plays in fostering peaceful and just societies. One of the key pillars of this initiative and one that resonates deeply with the focus of this summit is nuclear disarmament. The existence of nuclear weapons is a stark reminder of the fragility of our world. These weapons represent an unparalleled threat not only to international security but to the very survival of humanity. The potential for destruction they hold is beyond comprehension, and yet, as a global community, we have allowed this threat to persist for far too long. Dear audience, the Rules of Law on Earth initiative is committed to advancing nuclear disarmament as a top priority. We believe that legal frameworks grounded in the principles of justice, accountability, and transparency are the most effective tools we have to dismantle the systems that perpetuate nuclear proliferation. International treaties, conventions, and norms must be strengthened, enforced, and expanded to ensure that nuclear disarmament becomes not just a distant goal, but an urgent reality. However, nuclear disarmament is not solely the responsibility of the governments and policymakers. It is a responsibility that rests on all of us as global citizens. The rule of law is not an abstract principle confined to courtrooms and legal texts. It is a living, breathing force that must be championed by individuals and communities worldwide. That is why we are calling on young leaders like those gathered here today to take up the mantle for this fight. Your voices, your ideas, and your activism will be driving force behind the change we need. The Rules of Law on Art initiative will work tirelessly to build collaborative networks that bring together diverse voices from all corners of the world. We will partner with academic institutions, non-governmental organizations, and policy circles to advance research, develop policy frameworks, and foster dialogue on the critical issues of our time, nuclear disarmament being one of them. Our commitment to this partnership is rooted in the belief that no single entity can solve the world's problems alone. Only through collective action, informed by the rules of law, can we hope to address the complex challenges we face today. Let us not forget that nuclear disarmament is not an isolated issue. It is intricately linked to the broader concerns about justice, equality, human rights, and sustainable development. Disarmament is about more than just reducing weapons. It is about dismantling the systems of violence and inequality that perpetuate conflict and insecurity. It is about creating a world where resources are invested in education, healthcare, and environmental sustainability rather than in tools of destruction. As we embark on this journey with the Rules of Law on Art initiative, I ask each of you to reflect on the role you can play in this global effort. Whether as advocates, researchers, educators, or community leaders, each of us has a part to play in advancing the rule of law and promoting nuclear disarmament. The stakes are too high for inaction, and potential rewards of our collective efforts, peace, justice, and security for all, are too great to ignore. In conclusion, the inauguration of this initiative today is a call to action. It is a call to rise to the challenge of our time, to champion the rule of law as the foundation of global peace, and to work relentlessly toward a future free from the shadow of nuclear weapons. Together, through the principles of justice, equality, and resilience, we can build a world where the rule of law prevails and where future generations inherit a legacy of peace, not war. With these notes, I thank all of you for coming here this evening and attending the inauguration of this initiative. And before I conclude, I also introduce Dr. Ernst Thiessen and his brilliant work on Smart Settle. Today you are going to listen from him how this tool can also help us resolving the conflict internationally and globally. Thank you very much once again. Bye.
I'm just directing the panelists not to do the athletic jump up to the stage that Ernst had to do. There's steps on the other side of the stage. Ernest and I have decided we're having so much fun together, talking to each other. We met each other in person. We've been dealing with each other for a couple of years and virtually. And he's come to Winnipeg with his wife, and we've had so many great conversations and had so much fun. We decided that we'd do a duet. So if we're out of tune, you can blame our lack of musical talent. If we're in harmony, it's because we've lucked out. So Ernest, you take over, and I'm your backup.
Let's see. I think this works fine. You can just stay over there and stay close to that mic. And thought we were going to share a mic. We've got two of them. And you know, I've been so impressed with what's happened over these last couple of days with these students tackling the most important issue of our time, the nuclear weapons conflict. And, you know, when I was their age, your age, as many of you in this audience still, you know, I barely knew what a nuclear weapon was. And now I'm honored to be part of that movement to, you know, de-escalate that big problem. And so thank you, David, and thank you, Dr. Causer, for facilitating my introduction to this. I've been greatly honored to be part of, you know, this distinguished panel. Where are they anyways? I guess they're coming up here shortly. So, you know, all of you have challenged us to rethink global justice and peace. And basically in that challenge to reinvent the way society deals with conflict resolution. So David said we're going to be a duet here. We're going to be a bit of a tag team. So David, you need to interrupt me anytime. We haven't practiced this, by the way. So
well, I'm going to interrupt him right away because he opened the door when he thanked Causer and I for bringing him here. So you probably wonder why we bring in an engineer who has created a unique, high-tech, multi-algorithm way, which he will call augmented intelligence, to bring about cooperation, collaboration, and peacemaking sustainable outcomes. So when you saw the logo, and you've got some brochures on a few tables, the logo of Rules of Law on Earth has a circle of people holding hands. And it's got a scales of justice in the center, and it's got a circle in the center. So we needed someone to fill the circle with innovation, because the current system of peacemaking under Chapter 6, the United Nations Charter, doesn't seem to be working very well, does it? Doesn't prevent wars, doesn't end them, and things are getting worse. And we still have atomic weapons despite treaties that are supposed to prohibit them. So in that circle is Smart Settle, a tool. He's going to tell you about it.
So reinventing the way society deals with conflict resolution at Smart Settle, our vision is conflict resolution in a more peaceful, collaborative, and intelligent way. We have a neutral site on the internet where we have implemented 9 sophisticated algorithms. It's a secure, neutral site. You can think of it as an automated mediator of sorts, and it's designed to convert adversaries into collaborative, decision makers and guide them to a fair and efficient resolution to their conflicts. Even in the face of very difficult conflicts. So here we're depicting an example of a conflict. Too many people think about conflict as a one-dimensional tug of war. So we've got two sides here, A and B. And it's a difficult tug of war, and if there are more sides, they're somewhere in between. So if you're measuring what A wants, it starts at 0 at that end and comes up to 100% when A gets everything that they want. And it's just the opposite for B. They measure their satisfaction when A doesn't get anything, 100% when they get everything. And this is just basically an adversarial approach, as it says there. And so the problem here is that what one party gains, the other one loses. And, they'll be lucky if they get 50% of what they want. But and it's like you can't get any better than that solution, but it doesn't have to be this way. If we think about how Nobel laureate John Nash wanted us to think about conflict resolution. So this guy isn't supposed to be here.
I didn't give permission for my photo to be put in this.
Okay, well, let's skip ahead to where we were. And so basically he said, that one-dimensional way of thinking about conflict resolution doesn't work. Separate those scales and reorient them like this. So now what A wants is at the top, and what B wants is at the right. And it's not necessarily true that what one party loses, the other one gains, and vice versa. So we can take that 50-50 resolution that we saw on the other scale and plot it here. And when we do that, we see that there's actually room for the parties to get more, for both of them to get more. John Nash said that there is a theoretical limit to what these parties can get. And we're going to call that the efficiency frontier. And as soon as Kyle lets me get back to my clicker, then we'll show you where that is. And I think, let's see. Clicker's not working again. So there we go. All right, so that's a theoretical limit. But if it only was that easy, John Nash, that brilliant guy, got a Nobel Prize for an idea called the Nash equilibrium. And he said there's actually a practical limit to what these parties can achieve, and he called that the Nash equilibrium. So, and society is more or less stuck there in a lot of situations. So remember this screen. We're going to come back to it. First of all, let's go back to that other depiction of conflict, that one-dimensional one where society is really stuck. And suppose that Nash equilibrium is somewhere in the middle there. And, this is not such a bad place to be if both parties are like behaving and their minimum satisfaction levels are on the far side of that Nash equilibrium. But it becomes difficult if one party becomes dissatisfied with the status quo, and it becomes then a very dangerous Nash equilibrium. So, and we're gonna just put a little animation on here and reduce A's minimum satisfaction level to the other side of that Nash equilibrium. And now it's no longer an equilibrium. It's an equilibrium out of control. And if they have no other method of resolving this problem, they will resort to force to get what they want. And, that could erupt into war, and we know that's a problem. We have no shortage of examples. From in the Ukraine area, all the way from Ukraine's declaration of independence to the Russian invasion, there's a whole list of issues creating dissatisfaction there, and with dire consequences that we all know about. So, David, you're supposed to be interrupting me from
Well, when I'm looking at that, I mean, obviously that's a very negative progression. And the question is, what happened if Smart Cell got involved before Crimea? What if the interests of the people of Crimea wanting to self-determine were treated as an opportunity to bring in a proactive way of addressing the ways that could be done, perhaps within a binational national situation or confederation. This is nothing new to Canada, right? We did it with Quebec. So what do you think? Smart Cell could come in preventively?
We're going to show you an example in a few minutes of a simulation, not unlike what David is talking about. The other place where we've got an example of such a conflict is in the Middle East, and that's been a problem for a long, long time. It's reared its ugly head again, and much of the world is crying out for that to stop, yet to no avail. So,
how far back? I mean, the Israeli settlements issue in international law goes back to 1967, right? I mean, and way before then. So, but the international law has made rulings in terms of the protected territories, which have not been, I would say, recognized and acted upon by Israel. Is that right?
And it's a terrible situation. If that wasn't bad enough, we've got all kinds of other threats to human society. And most experts will place nuclear conflict at or near the top. That's been the subject of this summit here for the last 2 days. And there are many other threats to society. And, we're not doing very well. We've made it very clear that top threat, nuclear conflict, remains a very, very serious one, and we're not doing very well. We need to be better at that, and we've got like many other things that we should be shifting our attention to. And what's the problem? Why not?
Well, in 1969, the five powers having the right to nuclear weapons agreed in a treaty which came into effect in 1970 called the Non-Proliferation Treaty that they would in good faith negotiate nuclear weapon dismantlement. And despite that commitment, we've now had 54 years go by and that hasn't happened, right? So is this the kind of thing that could be dealt with a smart settle and explore why a violated treaty, which endangers the world on an hourly basis, hasn't been addressed and ways to do so?
So I'm going to tell you that one of the problems is that society is really reliant on adversarial methods. This is the heart of the issue, and David knows like more than any of the rest of it because he's been involved with this for so long. And you know,
I'll just chip in there when he puts in bullies that might speak to why we do have adversarial methods. So the adversarial methods in the logo for rules of law on earth, are in the scales of justice side of the circle. The circle side is the part where smart settle is in, and that's where you get to agreement in good faith ways. But the adversarial process is where ultimately a third party decides, that's a court, judge, and then there's effective and enforcement powers, however, not at the global level. So we have a great problem that the adversarial method doesn't provide enough of an inducement to drive people to the negotiating table to negotiate collaboratively in good faith, because they got nothing to lose. They're not accountable in the adversarial process at the global level.
okay, you said that very well, David. I don't need to elaborate on this. The adversarial method is just endemic in our society everywhere, and that needs to change. So, and who are the people? They're you and me. We should be involved, and basically everyone here has a role to play in making this world a better place. And why isn't it happening why is it not happening more quickly? Well, it's because people that need to do something about it are unrepresented. And those unrepresented stakeholders include the youth that have been here for 2 days, and not only the youth, but also women and civil society. If we would take only those three groups and represent them on this circle, how much of that circle do you think would be covered? Do you think more than half? Okay, surprising answer is actually most of the circle. So those are our unrepresented stakeholders. And to them, we can add Indigenous peoples, future generations, and the environment. You could go on forever about this, David.
Unfortunately, I do to the discontent of a lot of people, but I think the point is that now that we understand that we're all interdependent and interconnected, and the worldview of Indigenous peoples is that we're all our relations, the global human family consists of more than just people. It consists of even beings that we don't consider living beings. And that can be rocks, and it can be water, and it can be air, which the Indigenous people consider to be living beings as well. And the capacity to have the environment at the table, when one of the second most slower death human-generated extinction processes is climate change, global warming. So it's so imperative to have that represented through human agency at negotiating tables, along with future generations. And again, the indigenous people look 7 generations ahead, and they want to know the impacts. We should too. And the indigenous peoples themselves are amongst the oppressed, impoverished, vulnerable peoples of the world that should be represented at the table when their governments don't represent them or have any interest in their well-being. Thank you.
So let's go back to that situation where the world is mired, and we had these 2 parties here, A and B, in a situation where they're no longer satisfied. That Nash equilibrium has been relabeled as a status quo because it's no longer an equilibrium, and they've got no way to get out of this. They don't know how to collaborate, and so they're fighting. And we know lots of places where that's happening in this world. So, but there is hope if we understand this situation in a different way, in a way that John Nash said we should understand it. So here we can plot that 50% place where the parties were stuck. We can plot it on this graph near where that status quo is, and we can see that there actually is there is room to collaborate here and find a solution that would satisfy everyone, besides just going to war and fighting about it. That's called the zone of potential agreement. But we have a serious problem in this particular graph because the status quo is outside of that zone of potential agreement. But there is a way to get there. John Nash said, I've got a formula. It's called maximize the utility product. That was his algorithm that he invented. It was part of what he got that Nobel Prize for. But there was one other ingredient called collaboration. We have genuine collaboration that must be part of that. You add that formula to the situation, and you can actually have those parties move from the status quo to the efficiency frontier, to that fair and efficient solution. So what are we waiting for? Let's make it happen with the rules of law on Earth. Chapter 6 of the United Nations Charter already prescribes how to do that. They urge member nations to solve their differences with negotiation, mediation, arbitration, and other peaceful means. Isn't that right, David?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And what is astonishing, really, we've, for example, explored, Ted Turner created with $1 billion donation, the United Nations Foundation. And why wouldn't funds like that be used to support this kinds of means to get to yes, to get to agreement? There's an institution, a foundation, charitable organization, U.S. called Nuclear Threat Initiative, also founded by Ted Turner. And that's about 24 years old. Billions of dollars behind that. And has that succeeded in investing in reduction of the threats and risks of nuclear weapons? So what's wrong here? Why isn't this a priority investment? A question to think about.
So, David has reminded us that the United Nations Foundation, they have the capacity to both develop and implement the solutions that we need. And, you know, we have peacemaking institutions everywhere in the world to support this cause, and we could recruit civil societies everywhere, and that would be just like a very powerful coalition. And we don't have to rely on official routes to actually get to this solution. We can take a different track. It's called track 2 diplomacy to get there more quickly. So that's what we have in mind. And I'm about to introduce a video of an example of doing just that. So maybe I'll let you have your last comments before I introduce that video.
Yeah, no, this video is really chosen by Ernest and a lot of the folks that we work with internationally as the hot point and most difficult and tractable issue in current human history. And we chose it in no way to provoke anybody or upset anybody, but simply because if we don't start addressing these kinds of situations and show these kinds of situations perhaps could have been prevented. I mean, the whole history of this intervention by the tool of smart settle, along with the best mediators in the world and well-meaning people in, let's say, track 2 diplomacy, not the governments, but civil societies. I mean, and here we've seen civil societies in great stress because of student protests and all that kind of thing. Administration is not really handling it very well. And what if that kind of energy was channeled into this kind of diplomacy, involvement, multi-stakeholder participation to provide options to the combatants that want to use violence to get their way? Just think about it. At any stage of any one of the current historic conflicts, Russia, Ukraine, Israel, and West Bank, and Gaza, how many occasions could this have been prevented? How many occasions could it have been, there have been an intervention before October 7th and after October 7th and right now? So that's why it's been chosen. Focus on the screen.
Even if a ceasefire is achieved, one critical question remains. How long will it last? Our vision for Gaza extends beyond temporary fixes. It centers on a comprehensive Gaza Marshall Plan that fosters lasting peace through collaborative, inclusive decision-making. Smart Settle Infinity brings all parties to the table, ensuring that every voice is heard, leading to a truly optimal and sustainable consensus. This video will use a simulation of a hypothetical negotiation to illustrate such an approach, where we are not just aiming for an agreement, but for a transformative process where trust is built and conflict resolution becomes sustainable. Instead of waging war, we must focus on waging peace and building collaboration. At the heart of this approach is Smart Settle Infinity, which embraces the vision of conflict resolution through peaceful, collaborative, and intelligent methods. If you ask someone how the war in the Middle East could end, they might predict that Israel will win on the right side of this graph. Israel is obviously the stronger party, and the destruction that is happening is primarily on Hamas territory. Others will say that Hamas will win, because of the international support they have generated and accusations of genocide. Yet this violence extends far beyond the conflict between Israel and Hamas, entangling many sides, all of which are losing, no matter how you look at it. Other paths to peace are represented by this orange arrow. There is discussion of a Gaza Marshall Plan, yet bringing all the necessary parties to the table is daunting. Without the right approach, we risk remaining trapped in a dangerous Nash equilibrium. Describing the Nash equilibrium as a deadlock where no one wins, won John Nash a Nobel Prize. But he didn't stop there. Nash also devised a way to escape this deadlock, known as maximize the utility product. This algorithm reshapes the problem from a win-lose dynamic into a multi-dimensional approach, where it's possible for all sides to achieve gains. Assuming only two parties, we're now looking at the problem in two-dimensional satisfaction space. We've relabeled Hamas as Palestine to represent a bigger picture. They want to be at the top of this graph, while Israel wants to be at the right side. Now, it's no longer true that one party must lose when the other one gains. SmartCell employs a similar algorithm, maximize the minimum gain, which some experts consider as a superior alternative to national plan. Another name for this methodology is integrative negotiation. It applies to negotiations among any number of parties, but this algorithm is not enough. Nash also prescribed collaboration as part of the solution, though he didn't explain how to bring parties together. In this presentation, I'm going to describe a methodology for collaboration facilitated by SmartCell Infinity, but I'll also be the first to admit that even if we think we know how to do it, this will be no easy task. So, who are the parties we need to bring on board to negotiate a Gaza Marshall Plan? There are many. For the sake of this simulation, we've organized the stakeholders into 6 groups. The SmartCell collaboration process provides a groundbreaking platform for all parties, transforming traditional negotiation into a dynamic, cooperative experience. It starts with all these parties working together to create a single negotiating framework. This framework is like the final agreement, except for blanks representing issues still to be negotiated. With the help of wise mediators and skilled facilitators assisted by AI, collaborative stakeholders can build a single negotiating framework. This process redirects criticism away from the other parties and toward the single negotiating framework and mediators. This helps to reinforce collaboration, and the result is a comprehensive framework in short order. Once the parties have crafted a version of the single negotiating framework that reflects shared interests, they can begin modeling the problem within SmartCell Infinity. This collaborative process helps the framework evolve through multiple iterations, ultimately leading to the best possible outcome. In this case, a comprehensive Gaza Marshall Plan. Next, I'm going to describe in more detail the process depicted on this diagram. Building a single negotiating framework is the beginning of the modeling phase. This is a time to build and/or strengthen relationships. The parties can be physically face-to-face or meet virtually from opposite sides of the earth. The objective of this phase is for each stakeholder to bring all their issues to the table. No bargaining or formal exchange of proposals takes place during this phase, but the discussion will identify the range of possible outcomes on each issue. In our simulation, the 6 groups identified 10 broad categories that will include everything they care about in a comprehensive Gaza Marshall Plan. We're not going to take time to discuss these in any detail, but let's focus for a moment on the commitment to ceasefire. In the ceasefire category, the parties found significant common ground. They also identified 6 key options to consider moving forward. In a real negotiation, there would be much more detail than shown here. Each option is associated with a budget in billions of dollars. The simulation assumes stakeholders share costs in proportion to their GDP. For every dollar contributed by the Palestinians, the other parties contribute proportionally more. As the single negotiating framework evolves, the parties begin to model that framework within Infinity, which includes a preference representation for each of them. Each party does that separately. Any number of parties can be accommodated this way until they're all satisfied with the single negotiating framework and how it's modeled within SmartCell Infinity. This now represents a very well-defined problem, and as John Dewey said, a well-defined problem is already half solved. Now we're going to to simulate solving the other half of the problem, reaching an optimal consensus among 6 parties, while their communication is facilitated within the Smart Settle Infinity interface. This is the private point of view of the Palestinian leadership. The other 5 parties are being played by a robot. In a real-life negotiation, the Palestinians would work with skilled facilitators to model their preferences within Infinity. In this simulation, we simulated that process by recruiting AI to help us determine their preferences and those of each of the other 6 parties from information on the internet. Each party's preferences are kept confidential by the system, known only ever to that party, their facilitators, and to Smart Settle as an invisible and secure neutral site. The simulation generates a unique outcome, shaped by the collective preferences of all stakeholders. However, the key lesson here isn't the outcome, but the consensus-building process itself. The negotiating range on each issue here is oriented so that the most preferred options to the Palestinians are on the right-hand side. The entire list is in order of preference, from most important at the top to least important at the bottom. With the Palestinians required to pay only a relatively small portion of the costs, the importance of the cost issue is quite low, although not insignificant. The non-linear shape of the curve indicates that it becomes more difficult for the Palestinians to pay as the amount increases. Palestinians have assigned one importance point to the negotiating range from 0 to 100 million. This establishes the importance scale for all the other issues. The most important issue, worth 60 points, is prisoner exchange and refugee resettlement. This satisfaction graph shows 6 alternative outcomes, ranked by the Palestinian leadership. Their least preferred option, scoring -20, is international support resettlement. Several other options are much better, with the most preferred option being simultaneous complete release at 40 points. Recognition of sovereign borders and reconstruction and economic revival are also among the most important issues. Commitment to ceasefire, of course, is also very important, but this issue is assigned fewer points here because the negotiations have already assumed that a ceasefire will happen. The only issue about a ceasefire is how it will be implemented. There are 6 options in order of importance, from phased peace implementation to immediate full ceasefire. On the right side is where the Palestinians keep track of alternative outcomes. There is nothing yet on the table for all parties to see. The Palestinian leadership have created 5 private reference packages to help them understand their own preferences, and also for use in the bargaining phase about to begin. The ratings of these packages are determined by the individual importances assigned to the options that make up the package. The package least preferred to the Palestinians, worth only 7 points, is named status quo. An outcome at this end of the scale would be totally unacceptable. The Palestinians will walk away from the table before accepting anything worse than their walkaway package. Their goal is a solution worth at least 180 points. The package named Target would be quite acceptable to the Palestinians. However, the Palestinians decide to start by proposing something more optimistic. When they do so, the optimistic proposals of the other parties also appear on the table. Among those proposals, the one submitted by people at the heart of the conflict is most preferred, and the Palestinians readily accept that package. Their acceptance is indicated by a secret yellow dot. Other parties are unaware that the Palestinians have accepted package 3. The Palestinians also accept package 4. There are more packages acceptable to the Palestinians, but before accepting any of those, the Palestinians ask Smart Settle for a suggestion. Several suggestions appear. These packages not only fill in the gaps between the proposals, but are designed to be semi-optimal and draw the parties toward an optimal consensus. Before dealing with these suggestions, they accept package 5. Among the suggestions generated by Smart Settle, suggestion 15 looks most interesting and is accepted by the Palestinians. Smart Settle will declare an agreement if, at the end of a session, all parties have accepted the same package. Unfortunately, no agreement is reached in session 1. In session 2, the Palestinians decide to propose their concession package. No agreement is reached in Section 2. In Section 3, the Palestinians decide to put their target package on the table, but they do so in secret. This is done by publishing the package anonymously. The target package is disguised as a typical suggestion. This strategic move is known as a masquerade. This technique helps to remove bias that would prevent other parties from accepting such a package. At the close of Section 3, the Palestinians are thrilled when Package 15 is declared the baseline agreement, surpassing their target expectations. The excitement is palpable, but with their training on Infinity's ability to uncover hidden value, an improvement is requested. Smart Settle generates Package 23, which becomes the final agreement after all parties confirm that it is even better than the baseline. This moment highlights the transformative power of the Smart Settle Infinity process, uniting parties and achieving surprising outcomes beyond their expectations. The improvement is worth 9 points more to the Palestinians than the baseline agreement. And in fact, if we were to also view this negotiation from each other party's perspective, we would see that the improvement was worth a grand sum of $6 billion overall. This optimized consensus would cost an estimated $24 billion, but the mutual benefit to all stakeholders is 7 times greater, at $171 billion. What are we waiting for? Did you catch what happened? Let's review the process by examining a graph in satisfaction space, which illustrates how parties were able to move toward a mutually beneficial solution, ultimately achieving a level of consensus previously thought unattainable. This graph assumes that a comprehensive single negotiating framework has been created, and each party's preferences are well represented, known only to the Smart Settle Infinity mutual side. The stage is set for the integrated bargaining phase of a Smart Settle negotiation. The animation here will show how the bargaining phase works for 2 parties, Palestine and Israel in this case. Palestine wants an outcome as close to the top as possible, 100% on the vertical scale, and Israel wants an outcome that is as far to the right as possible, 100% on the horizontal scale. Clearly, they will need to settle for something less than that, but each party will not agree to anything worse than the status quo, so we've labeled that point as 0-0. In game theory, the status quo is also called the Nash equilibrium, if it's a place where decision makers get stuck and have no incentive to move to a better place, even if that better place exists. This is especially serious if the Nash equilibrium is dangerous. The status quo levels, together with the efficiency frontier, define a zone of possible agreement. But each party also has a minimum level of satisfaction that they would be willing to accept. These levels define a zone of likely agreement. The Smart Settle process proceeds as follows. Parties are encouraged to exchange optimistic proposals that represent somewhat more than they would consider fair, so that they still have some room to concede, but not so much more that the other party is offended. In this example, neither party would accept the other party's optimistic, because they are both outside the zone of possible agreement. But Smart Settle can generate suggestions that fall between the optimistic proposals. Some of these packages fall in the zone of possible agreement, and may be acceptable to the parties. The suggestions most likely to become an agreement are the ones that are above the target levels. Parties reach a baseline agreement at the end of a session if they have all accepted the same package. Finally, Smart Settle generates an improvement to suggest a fair solution on the efficiency frontier. This last step invokes our signature algorithm, maximize the minimum gain, that some authorities on the subject prefer to natural solution. But it does the same thing, providing parties a way to escape the Nash equilibrium and reach a fair and efficient solution on the efficiency frontier. By definition, any solution on the efficiency frontier is as good as you can get. There is no way to make it any better for one party without making it worse for some other party. The Smart Settle process works for almost any formal negotiation that you can imagine between any number of parties. When adding a third party like the West, the efficiency frontier becomes a service. This has the potential to tremendously complicate the negotiations. But with smart selling, the parties never see most of this. It's all under the hood. Each party needs only to focus on their own point of view, and their experience in a multi-party negotiation is not much different than with only two parties. The final outcome is a consensus in which the blanks in the single negotiating framework are filled in to become the final agreement to be implemented. We have some good videos illustrating this process. Email us for the links if you can't find them on our website. I'd like to leave you with this. The amount of money the world spends on peacemaking is minuscule compared to the costs of war. If we moved over only a quarter of that, we would have enough to accomplish all the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, and there'd still be $6 trillion left. Imagine how much more could be done if we were able to motivate collaboration the way we've shown you today. Peace is within reach. We invite decision makers, stakeholders, and supporters to help make this vision a reality. Building a future where Gaza is rebuilt, restored, and truly at peace. Thanks for watching.
Would the panelists please come forward now? We're now going to have the panel discussion, but while we're doing that and they're getting their exercise, stand up, stretch, just make some movement. You've been sitting patiently and hearing us, so just lift your arms over your head and stretch, and we'll get settled in here. And Rochelle Squires is going to take over the mic as moderator, and I'll give her space.
Thank you very much, David, and I'm glad that he invited you all to have a little bit of a stretch as we settle into the next portion of this evening. My name is Rochelle Squires, and I'm a former MLA for Riel and member of the Executive Council and a longtime mentee of David Newman, and just really want to thank David Newman for organizing tonight and bringing us all together here, and for certainly introducing me to the rules of law on earth. So it's hard to believe, but we are almost at our 10th, no, we just surpassed our 10th anniversary of this museum's opening. And it's a stunning thought to think about how many people have come through here and been introduced to the Canadian Museum for Human Rights and really been introduced to a lot of these concepts. And so tonight I'm really happy to be here with my friend and former colleague, the former Minister of Canadian Heritage, who was instrumental in seeing this museum open, which was the first national museum to open outside of Ottawa in a very, very long time. So welcome, Shelley Glover. Thank you for being here tonight. So I'm going to try to get myself set up here, and then I'm going to introduce to you these wonderful people that are joining me on stage. So we have Senator Mary Lou McPhedran, who probably doesn't need much of an introduction, but it is my pleasure to share with you a little bit about her. She is a human rights lawyer, a professor, activist, and was appointed as an independent senator in the Parliament of Canada by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in November 2016. Mary Lou was one of the most influential leaders of the 1981 Ad Hoc Committee of Canadian Women on the Constitution Conference, the grassroots social movement of women across Canada that resulted in stronger equality rights in the Constitution. She co-founded several internationally recognized nonprofit Canadian organizations, such as the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund. She was the founding principal of the University of Winnipeg Global College and has facilitated student access to UN sessions for more than 20 years to provide practical skill building by providing rapporteur services to NGO presentations. She is a founding board member of the Global Network of Women Peace Builders and has given extensive voluntary support to civil society organizations focused on peace building and women's rights. She attended the ICANN Nuclear Ban Forum and the first meeting of states parties to the TPNW in Vienna, and continues to strongly advocate for the Canadian government to sign the TPNW, and we'll learn more about that when we hear from Senator Mary Lou McPhedran, but welcome. Next, I want to introduce to you, well, we'll go in the order here that people are seated. Dr. Ernest Thiessen, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. And let me tell you just a little bit about Dr. Thiessen. He's the president of the ICANN Systems, Inc., the developer of the Smart Settle e-negotiation system. Dr. Thiessen has led ICANN's research and development efforts since 1993 to implement ICANN's patent, creating the world's first secure multi-party collaborative negotiation support system on the internet. Dr. Thiessen also directs the International E-Negotiations Exhibition and was the lecturer in 2010 for the UNESCO's IHE's Negotiation and Mediation for Water Conflict Management course. He has been the guest speaker at many international forums on online dispute resolution, and he is prior to founding the ICANN system, Dr. Thiessen worked for 17 years as a consulting engineer and a researcher in Canada and Nepal. Welcome here today. Next to Dr. Thiessen, we have Rose Ally. She is a third-year undergraduate student at the University of Toronto studying peace, conflict resolution, justice, history, and political science. She has taken part in various events and projects, including the launch of Reverse the Trend, Save Our Planet, Save Our People. Since she was first introduced to nuclear disarmament in 2019, the Rotary Club of Winnipeg and District 5550 supported Rose's attendance at the first meeting of the states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. She is a member of the Canadian Council of Young Feminists and previously held an internship as a Manitoba High School liaison in Senator Mary Lou McPhedran's office and attended the Hiroshima G7 Youth Summit as a Canadian delegate. Welcome. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. John Guilfoyle. Dr. Guilfoyle lives in Squamish, British Columbia, and has had a diverse career in medicine, which included full-service family practice in rural Newfoundland and Manitoba, and a role as the Chief Medical Officer of Health for Manitoba. He served as the Chief Medical Officer in a small Caribbean country, and upon returning to Canada, he directed the residency program in family medicine at the University of Manitoba while working with the J. Hills Northern Medical Unit. This experience led him to focus on Indigenous health. He was awarded a Fellowship of Women's Health from the College of Family Physicians of Canada and worked for nearly 20 years in Sioux Lookout, Ontario. He is the director of the Pebbles to Pearls Foundation, a registered charity focused on providing access to education, particularly for women and girls, as a path to well-being and prosperity. He has promoted peace since the 1980s with the Canadian Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, where he served as president. Although he became less active as the Cold War ended, he has re-engaged in recent years due to deteriorating global conditions, serving as the president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War Canada and on the International Council as well. He is the interim chair of the steering committee for the Canadian Network for the abolition of nuclear weapons. So welcome. So this is definitely an esteemed panel. And I just want to start off by asking each member of each of our panelists to just describe a little bit in their own words, in their own heart, what brought them out here tonight and what really got them engaged in trying to spread the message of peace and nuclear disarmament in their daily lives. So we'll start with you, Senator.
Yes. Okay. I've just spent the better part of the last 2 days with the amazing network of volunteers from the Manitoba Association of Rights and Liberties, from Rotary District 550, from the Peace Partners from Rotary that was founded by David Newman, and over 150 people, most of them high school students, a few university students, with energy that we all need in our lives, maybe particularly this week. And it brought me here because I felt that the discussion we need to have requires a more in-depth examination of what some of the structural possibilities are, some of the ways in which there can be methodology toward, and not only in the Gaza situation, but of course that is for many of us one of the worst aspects of having to essentially view in real time the kind of devastation that is going on and that began with the horrific events of October 7th. And I am hoping to learn from the panel, and I also was very pleased to be part of the panel with the particular people that are here tonight, including you. It's great to see you again.
It's always a wonderful pleasure to see you. Thank you so much. Dr. Thiessen.
Well, I think you've already figured this out, but, when I learned of David Newman's launch of the rules of law, I thought, well, that just goes really well with what we're trying to do. Let's work together. David Newman thought the same thing, so here we are.
And Rose.
Thank you. Well, for myself, I first got introduced to nuclear disarmament and peace work in this regard through the first ever Youth Nuclear Peace Summit. So this was very nostalgic for me, but for me, peace work goes back to since I was born in Syria and came to Canada as a refugee. So peace work and working towards peace has always been a very integral part of my identity. And a really significant part of being here at this conference during this time is that a lot of young people are feeling a lot of increased anxiety, especially with the recent election. And we had a lot of students that attended the summit that were from the United States. And amongst young people, they are very in tune with politics, and there's a lot of shared anxiety and grief over the things we're seeing around the world. So the conference did serve as a way for us to think of proactive measures to take in order to quite realistically assess how we're supposed to continue forward. So it's a time of a lot of anxiety and heightened stress, and I came here as hoping to be a medium for encouragement and also reflection to back towards the young people that attended, as I started just where they were, and really trying to encourage them that there's a long path ahead of them, but they're headed in the right direction.
And what a wonderful voice to deliver that message to youth. So thank you very much for being such a role model and a spokesperson. Tell us, when was your first youth summit that you attended?
It was in 2019, so it was the first one that was held in this very room, and it really set a precedent for youth-based events.
Well, it's a pleasure to meet you, and thank you for everything you're doing. Dr. Guilfoyle, what brought you out here, besides Manitoba's beautiful weather?
I was going to say Air Canada, but anyway, it's an extraordinary privilege and pleasure to be here, and it's wonderful to hear about the rules of law on earth, because our legal colleagues are wonderful and they focus on rights. As a physician, we focus on needs, and without rights, you can't have needs, and needs are so important because all of us have needs. And peace is an essential need. Peace is essential for health. And to explain to you how I got involved in this, I'll just share a little story. I was a family physician out in Haniota. Who here knows where Haniota is? And it was 1982, 83. I arrived and I was out, I had just seen a patient, a farmer, just before lunch. And he was a little overweight, and he drank a little bit more than he was wise, and he smoked. So I said to him, well, look, the biggest threats really to your health here are really the smoking, and maybe, cut back the alcohol, a bit of exercise. So at that point in time, I used to run triathlons, that sort of stuff. So at lunchtime, I had half an hour, and you could go around the section. if you were really training in about 26 to 28 minutes, you really pushed it. And so I'm out there running, beautiful blue sky, it was a July day, nothing in the sky, for 2 people, 52 pounds. Each one holding the equivalent of all the explosives, all the theaters in the Second World War. And they were bound on a mission to the Arctic Circle and to target more targets than were really available in the Soviet Union. And their mission was drop your ordnance unless you're called back. That was the state of readiness that existed at that time. And I looked at this, jogging along, and the juxtaposition of what I just told my patient, that the biggest threats to their health were their personal behaviors. And I look upstairs and I see what the world, or at least the wisest in the world, have produced for them. That juxtaposition focused for me that as a physician, I have a responsibility, not just to those who come to me for care, but to the large responsibility we have as a profession to really profess and develop a situation where the health for all is possible. And the threats that prevent that are something I have to work on, and I share that mission with everybody else. As physicians, I'm not just the one who's responsible, but certainly our responsibility is to make a diagnosis. And this diagnosis is that peace is essential for health. That using violence to solve conflict is maladaptive. It's possibly pathological. It's possibly a disease. I don't want to stigmatize it, but it is something which we need to expunge and relegate to the tides of history. And the polycrisis we face, which is a crisis in every dimension, humanity has really gone beyond the ability of the planet to support us. And it will require solutions and collaboration at a level we've never had in human history. And if we continue to plan to kill each other, we cannot solve the polycrisis. So the diagnosis is, that's the diagnosis. And we can propose treatments, but the issue with treatment is, this was always the debate as a physician, the individual has to make a choice and decide whether they will adopt the treatment. And that's what we're here about, and what we're hearing tonight is this wonderful solution. You know what I mean? This could be part of treatment. And this is so exciting that we're getting this sort of thinking, and a group of people who will come out on an evening and listen to something as ambitious and as innovative as has been described here. So that's why I'm here, and it's a great privilege.
Well, that is a very inspiring and fascinating perspective of a physician, and giving counsel on longevity and health. So I'm going to ask a question to you in response to some things that you've said and what all the panelists have shared, and then we'll just go down the line. But so all of you are leaders in your own world in promoting peace. But what do you say to somebody, whether it be a patient or one of your constituents or a classmate in your school, that says, I'm just one person, I can't really make a difference. I don't have a title, I don't have wealth, I don't have influence, I'm just one person. I can't make a difference. What do you say to them? Who wants to start? Okay.
I would say that if we all adopted that mentality, if we all had that mentality, then we as women would never have had the right to vote. We would have never really liberated anybody. People part of the LGBTQIA plus community would have never had the right to get married or even be recognized. I think all of these issues were once very grand in the big picture and seemed unattainable for a large group of people, yet we still got to a point where we are able to access those rights, except now we're seeing a lot of those rights be infringed upon and be redacted. So to that I would say we've done it before. I really don't see why we can't do it again.
That's a great answer. Senator?
Thank you. Well, I find myself as a lawyer reflecting on so much of the theme this evening being the rule of law. And that it is probably true that without litigation, one person can't do very much. That is typically the tool that begins movements. And there's limited application of one particular case that is litigated. But often what we see, ranging from non-smoking bylaws that took 20 years to develop to the point where they really were protecting public health, to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and organizations like the Legal Education Action Fund, the Women's Leaf Fund, that has the purpose of litigating, and typically you have one, maybe two litigants in a case, but that is the beginning of spreading understanding and the building of movements. And it's movements that actually bring about the kind of large-scale change that we're discussing here.
Excellent. Dr. Thiessen, did you want to add to that?
Well, I'm just reminded of that story of the little girl that met the old man on the beach, and he said to all of those starfish that were stranded on the beach, you know, she's throwing, you know, one by one back into the ocean. And you're never going to make any difference here. She said, well, it made a difference to that one.
It's a great story.
Thank you so much. I think it was Gandhi who said it's likely that you will only do a very small thing, but it's of utmost importance that you do it. And the real challenge for humanity at the moment is that we have a competing ideas about what it is to be human. We are either Homo economicus or we are Homo sapiens. And if we are Homo economicus, we are exactly where Homo economicus would place us. At each other's throats, contending about a planet which is groaning under our weight and on which we are placing excessive demands in a heedless fashion. Or we are Homo sapiens, who has been informed by the wisdom that has been transmitted through generations and through so many traditions, and is exemplified in many ways by the indigenous sisters and brothers that we have. And this is the crux we have as individuals. We have a choice, or we have a pathway, where these traditions, these different parts of the human, the physical and the spiritual, need to come together in a new way and understand what Justice Murray Sinclair, in his wisdom, he encapsulated the Truth and Reconciliation Commission with, we must forge and maintain respectful relationships within our own selves. Peace starts internally. Then with others, in our families and our communities. And then beyond that, so that we spread this as golden threads of love across the world. And we all have a small piece in that. And we have to think that even though it's a global problem, the solutions are going to be local. If we can't be peaceful in our relationships with each other and in communities, and solve serious community problems, okay? Because if we don't solve homelessness in places like Winnipeg and Vancouver, where I come from, we're not going to solve the climate crisis. We need to work together in ways where somebody else's problem is my problem. And from a mental health point of view, we have an epidemic of anxiety. The biggest antidote to anxiety and the biggest arbiter and marker of good mental health is when you're helping someone else. Simply helping someone else do something useful is probably one of the most useful things to contribute in a global way. And of course, we must think globally, but act globally. There's all kinds of connections, because Everything is linked. Every act we make is political, has an impact on resources. Doesn't have to be partisan, that's a real problem in the world. But everything we do has an impact on resources, and that's what politics is, how we choose to spend resources.
It's good feedback, and of course, we're all familiar with the quote, be the change that you wish to see in the world, and I think that's what all of our panelists are saying. I'm going to read a quote from the late Betty Reardon, who is a personal friend of Senator McFedrin's. But if you had a chance to walk around and read the exhibits on the panels displayed throughout the room, you would have seen what Betty had to say as as a pioneer of peace education. More than any other manifestation of patriarchy, the compulsive acquisition and excessive use of weaponry demonstrate the abuse of power by the male-dominated state system. Like all addictions, the addiction to weaponry wreaks negative results on the systems in which it occurs. There's a lot there to unpack. Very powerful words. And what also came to mind when I was reading this was how women are often, they're on the front lines of casualty for war and other manifestations of disharmony, whether it be poverty or displacement. And so I wanted to ask, particularly our two wonderful feminists on the panel, what does this quote mean to you? And what do you think we can do in our sort of march for equality and justice to help, address these manifestations of patriarchy that Betty was talking about?
Well, I'll start by just reinforcing what you said about Dr. Betty Reardon, Rochelle, and thank you for choosing that quote. More than anything, every time there needed to be action taken, Dr. Reardon moved to education as the primary way to make change. And she, as one of the world's first and among the foremost peace educators, she didn't make a distinction between your age, whether you were quote school age or not. Firmly believed that we exist as humans in a constant learning state, and that it is adaptation through knowledge that brings people to the conclusion that the kind of militarism and unrestrained acquisition of weapons is a kind of insanity. And that the way in which I believe she intended her reference to patriarchy was with no intention whatsoever to trash individual males, people who identify as male. She's talking systems, she's talking institutions, and she's identifying the fact that every institution that we have to navigate in our society was formed by men for men. Whether it's a university, whether it's a hospital, whether it's the bubble in which I go to work in Ottawa, it's formed by men with a vision of a male vision, because that's the only people who were making those decisions and allocating those resources at that time. And none of those institutions have changed substantially. So it becomes a matter of navigating the system, and typically the system is stronger than the individual. Certainly, I think there are enough people in this room that have navigated any one of the institutions I mentioned to know that that is typically the case. And so the notion of patriarchy is really another way of defining the status quo. And the truth of the matter is that very few of our institutions they are all still patriarchal, and very few of them have actually been successfully, substantively changed. And so what she's talking about is such an interesting combination. because then she goes to addiction. And she talks about the damage that addiction does to the system where the addiction is. And I think that part of what she intended us to draw from that was an understanding that by not seeing clearly that we are navigating still institutions and systems that have not substantially changed and that are, for the most part, built on quite a violent vision of how people have to learn to quote unquote succeed, that in itself is feeding back on itself. And I think we're seeing that, we're experiencing that. We're seeing certainly evidence of the classic definition of fascism that's been dressed up as a kind of authority and a kind of credibility. We're seeing a retreat from basic democratic principles. Certainly in Ottawa, we're seeing a retreat on the part of many parliamentarians from anything that we would consider a decent investment of public money. The kind of bad behavior that is being funded by taxpayers is quite astonishing. So I think part of what Betty was conveying there was that the lack of consciousness around what we consider to be normal and the way in which we allow that machinery to just become a juggernaut and drive itself is what is feeding to the kind of destruction that we're seeing of the rule of law, certainly, without doubt. To the point about women and girls, I think as a fact, and this is not only from one source, and it is also not only from one conflict, typically the majority of those who suffer the most under conflict, whether it's what's happening in Ukraine, whether it's what's happening in Gaza, are women and children. The majority. But the machinery that Betty's talking about is largely created and sustained by men through violence.
You've mentioned so many interesting things that I want to pick up on, but first I want to go to Rose and have her respond to that quote from Dr.
Thank you. I read that quote.
Dr. Bearden, pardon me, sorry.
I read that quote myself, and I think it's a really powerful quote that encompasses a lot of dimensions. I think Senator McFedrin put it so eloquently, how everything that falls into that, and how the systems currently look, and how we're still functioning under the same system that were built without women in mind, without marginalized people in mind. And something that comes to mind for me is specifically on the language that we've normalized around weaponry, around war. And it's very masculinized language. And that's something I've learned along the way being taught by other women about how the way in which we speak about these topics really influences how we view them as qualities that are considered, let's say, less desirable in international relations and politics, oftentimes fall into qualities we typically assign to women. And those who fall under that umbrella, qualities such as empathy, such as love, such as understanding, whilst other qualities that we deem acceptable to deciding the fate of the world, such as rationality and logic, we typically see best suited for men to take up that mantle. Yet right now we're seeing leadership on an international scale that is the least logical it has been in a very long time, and that leadership is dominated primarily by men. And that is, again, I think Senator McFedrin put it really well. I don't think the quote is to demonize or target a specific person, but there is a system in place that is meant to suppress a certain group of people who are oftentimes in these cases the most victimized and are the most likely to suffer in war, in the use of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons testing, in really any kind of conflict. They are the victims, yet qualities in which we need to dismantle these systems are considered too feminizing to actually integrate into our lives, into our teachings, and especially into how we operate international relations. So I think we need to really think about how we're using the terminology and what we're deeming to be too feminine in international politics, because it doesn't quite resonate. And I think it's perpetuating systems of violence that are actively working to suppress every marginalized group. And they're least represented in those spaces as well. And I think that there's a problem there in language and how we talk about things.
That's so interesting. And as someone who's ran 4 campaigns, I can tell you that the language has been adopted by our democratic system. And so when we're getting ready to campaign, we talk about having a war room, we talk about the war chest. All the language of campaigning is now really focused on that language of war. And it's really indicative of how where democracy is going, and it's a patriarchal structure that so many people are disengaged from, because we see voter turnouts are declining. And you mentioned it earlier in your talk about how partisanship is really a challenge, and it's an adversarial system. And I know we've got a lot of former parliamentarians in this room who will probably agree. Anybody who's ever sat in the House of Commons, or anybody who's ever sat in the legislative assemblies in one of our provinces will tell you that it is an incredibly adversarial system that arguably is ineffective. And I'm being polite. So, Dr. Guilfoyle, do you want to pick up on that?
Yes, I would love to. I mean, yes, what you've all said is so applicable. I mean, what we know from public health, if you educate a woman and you give her access to resources, the health of the family, the health of the community, the health of the nation increases. I mean, it's an absolute no-brainer. And the point you were making about language and kind of spaces where either women aren't allowed, or they're not allowed by convention, or not allowed just by the language and the lack. And this language is so important, and it's not just, it's the tone and the words we use and how we use them. And we have, the way we measure things in the world, like we've the GDP, and the percentage growth. But where's there a metric about love? Or even about kids having breakfast in the morning? Some of the metrics which make a difference in their lives, and they mostly make the difference in the lives of women and children, because, if we're going to be sensible about human survival, that's where you need to invest. And yet, if we look globally, what we invest in, and how, for example, this is something I was involved in women's health for the last 20 years. Do you know what the first thing to go once health services resources go down? It's maternity. Like every less than rural setting where they've had struggles, it's the maternity services that go, because women can travel. Having babies is just, they've always been doing it. They're all good with it, right? I mean, as I like to say, first baby was a man had it, and they said, I think we'll outsource this. No, but the point being is, the safety and well-being of humanity is vested in how we look after, and not look after, but allow women become, because I'd like to share an image. Humanity is a bird. It has 2 wings. One is man, one is woman. And unless they are equally developed, we are not going anywhere.
Well put.
Just pick up on that just very quickly, because I think there is actually an evolution that is underway that is resisted in many forms, and certainly in different parts of Canada and the world. And that is actually that the human reality is probably not binary. It's probably not actually only male, only female. This is a construction of patriarchal institutions, and it is a way of organizing and controlling people and labeling people. And I think one of the reasons that we are seeing globally tremendous backlash to gender diversity is precisely because it actually dismantles a lot of the fundamental patriarchal notions that within which we all live our lives. And it's experienced as a genuine threat. And indeed, it is a fundamental change in how human beings see themselves, see others. And if you apply that notion of the kind of respect we've been discussing, it creates a very different equilibrium for human society.
Yeah, and you mentioned the key word there, change, and it is something that most of us we repel. We'll do anything to avoid change, and yet change is constant. So, Dr. Thiessen, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the intersection between like smart settle, how that could facilitate greater implementation of democracy that would be a truer representation of what the people actually want.
Well, I have actually thought a lot about using smart self-infinity within the political system. In fact, I offered it to the states, but they didn't take me up on that. It could be a way, I mean, it could be used to develop consensus among politicians in a way that is very different from the way they're doing it now. And just extrapolate from what you saw in the video into political decision. So, just give me an opportunity, I can show you that.
It's a wonderful thought to rest my mind on, and to think that there's possibly another way for politicians to come to consensus and resolve some of the problems that are faced in society that's separate and apart from this dysfunctional adversarial situation that we have right now, where, I mean, I can tell you, I've sat in the legislature and listened to members opposite bring up something that I actually agreed with. I thought it was a really good idea. I want to vote in favor of that. And I'm sure my friend, my former colleague, Dr. John Gerard, he probably had the same, feelings many times, where you hear something from members opposite that it's a good idea and you want to support it, and yet there's these structures in place and it gets very complicated. It's so complicated, it's silly. And you end up not leading with your heart and not leading with your conscience and going along these rigid party lines that seem to be becoming even more divisive and more ingrained and entrenched than ever before. And so I certainly do look to people, all of you in the room and our wonderful panelists and other problem solvers to hopefully elevate democracy from where it's at right now. So we're getting a little close to the closing time, but I do want to offer another quote and get some reaction. And it's another quote that I read, that I paused on one of the panels, and it's from Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, when he said, "The world is overarmed and peace is underfunded." Why do you think that is? And what can we do about it? Let's start with you, Senator.
Well, with all its flaws, all of its imperfection, we have only one form of global governance that is predicated on peace, and that is the United Nations. And the idea of somehow shutting it down and starting again probably is not the least bit realistic. And so then it becomes a question of who is prepared to invest in making the kind of changes and sustaining a system of global governance that is predicated on peace. And I think that the reality for those of us who work in the UN system is that going to a meeting at the UN headquarters in New York, or going to the Human Rights Center of the UN in Geneva, those meetings now, for the most part, are cut short every day. And the escalators aren't working, and sometimes the elevators aren't working, and the way in which staffing has been reduced. I mean, there is a near bankruptcy. The last time we saw this was when President Bush of the United States decided to basically stop most of the funding. And we are likely going to see a version of that again. So with all of our concerns, and many of them are very legitimate about the UN, we really have to ask ourselves what kind of an alternative there would be without any kind of mechanism, without the system of international law, the treaties that are based entirely on the notion of trying to build peace and sustainable development. And so, it's a kind of luxury it's a bit simple-minded, frankly, to just say, we're just going to get rid of that. I mean, figuring out what we would do instead of being honest about it means that we really should be looking at the kinds of systemic changes that need to be made in order to continue to have a form of global governance that is predicated on peace and peace building.
Excellent answer. Go ahead, Dr. Cheatham.
I think more and more people, we've witnessed it here the last couple of days with these young people that like peacemaking is important, and more people getting involved in peacemaking is important, and we just have to demonstrate how it can be really effective, and I think that's when we show that, then more funding will go towards what's really effective.
I'll add more to the really wonderful points that have been made. For me as a young person and looking at peace and looking at how underrepresented youth are in major discussions, I think that a large part on why peace is underfunded is that there is less profit to be made when you don't have a large amount of people to take advantage of and push into like a box and to manipulate and use for the means of expanding your resources, your country, your profit. A lot of countries have built their foundations on the oppression of others, on the blood, bones, and tears of others. That is how Canada was founded. That is how most developed countries today have been founded. It is on that very system of oppression that was built. And I think the policymakers we are seeing today, a lot of them that are not investing in peace, I feel are very far removed from the average everyday person. We've gotten to a point where we're starting to see people close their doors to one another, and we're seeing a decline in global citizenship because we're no longer a human race, we're just individual people. And I think the farther away we get from this collective community sense of the human race, the more it becomes easy to invest in war, to invest in military, to invest in anti-peace movements, because there is a personal profit to be made there. And there's less so when we're able to kind of see each other as human beings and not dehumanize others to the point in which we are comfortable dropping weapons of mass destruction on them in an indiscriminate way, where we're wiping out millions and leaving intergenerational trauma in the place. And the people that are suffering those impacts are not the people making those decisions. They are not our prime ministers, they're not our presidents. They are civilians and people, and I think that we've reached a point where there is such a cognitive dissonance between these areas where people are not quite seeing each other as people. We've just dehumanized one another to such an extreme that they've gotten very comfortable with doing these acts of violence and not representing the people that are the victims of these violence. And I think, like, as a young person, and we're seeing that many of us, some of us aren't at voting age yet, but when we do, we need to really consider who we're voting in, and we want people that can represent the people, that can represent those that are the victims of these acts and of these violences. I think dehumanization and closing our doors to one another and not building in global citizenship and community, which was a very common theme of the Youth Nuclear Peace Summit, which was really wonderful to see. And I think a decline in that is we're seeing a lack of investment in peace because there's less of a profit to be made there.
True words.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Yeah, peace. I think it's underfunded because to a large extent, it's really underdemanded. And we are preoccupied with so many other either distractions or real problems. I mean, if you're struggling to make ends meet, global peace is a very, very lofty and maybe an inconsequential goal given what many people face in so many parts of the world. Which then brings us to the question of those of us who live in societies where we have enormous privilege, which puts it unfair, maybe, but I don't think so. But it puts a responsibility, because with great privilege comes great responsibility. I think there are a couple of elements of that need to be explored. One is the role of civil society organizations. I think that, well, they're underfunded, but they need to work on that. But there's a real role for civil society organizations. This would not really have happened here without the work of civil society organizations and others coming together to say, you know, obviously building this was an enormous enterprise, but making it actually relevant in the world where there may be a diminution of support for global organizations is actually going to be the key endeavor. Those of us who are in the privileged position of being able to, for example, use this Museum of Human Rights to be a beacon globally for conversations that can be beamed across the world and resources that can be shared so that the particular elements that are required for peace, it's not just an aspirational goal, but there's actually ways in which it can be achieved, and everything goes from global governments, supporting institutions and supporting tools like Ernest has created. These all need to be part of the conversation. And those of us who are privileged enough to recognize that need to be involved in more elevated conversations, which are examining the nuances of this, and not just defining it, well, it's China or it's somebody else. Canada, I think, has a huge role, potentially. We've given ourselves a big pass in saying that we're wonderful. There's so many elements of Canadian history that we ought not be proud of. We have contributed in every aspect of the bombing of Hiroshima. We have that is part of our collective. And if it is, now we have part of our future is to make sure that can never happen again. And that's just one example. We can't give ourselves a pass as Canadians. We have to take it on that we have been part of the problem and we continue to be part of the problem. So that's part of the reason why it's underfunded, because we're not taking on the responsibility either at probably a personal level, but at a community level. There is a responsibility there. And that's not to make us feel bad about it. We should gird our loins and say, we've learned from the past. We've had our truth and reconciliation. But reconciliation is not putting up with barriers. Reconciliation is looking to the future and deciding it is going to be different to the past. And that is something that I think should spark us to re-gird our loins. And there may be ill winds blowing from other parts of the world, and we can look south of us, and I won't even go there. But it's an ill wind that doesn't blow smooth. There is something that can be got out of our present situation that should spur us on to greater good.
Thank you for that. And it's hard to believe that we're almost coming to the end of our time here. As someone who's an eternal optimist, though, I'm going to try to flip the switch and end on some encouraging words. And so my question is relating to the world that we inherited from our ancestors and the world that we're passing on down to the next generation. Do you feel, in what capacity do you feel that there have been gains made and the world a better place than what we had inherited and that we're passing on? So for example, in my life, I look at women's rights. My grandmother was a survivor of domestic violence, barely survived. My mother as well was discriminated against and struggled her whole life based on a patriarchal society and how it treated women. And I think that the world that I inherited from my ancestors was better than what they had in some areas. Women's rights are undoubtedly progressed. And that is my commitment to pass on to the next generation, is to continue fighting for equality in all its forms. And so that's what I commit myself to in recognition of my ancestors' struggles. So what is the world a better place today than what you'd inherited from your ancestors?
For me, yes, but I'm actively working with Afghan women and girls still. And they're getting letters, money's being raised for full scholarships at universities and high schools here in Canada, full scholarships. And they're still getting letters from IRCC telling them that they're being denied a study permit because IRCC is not convinced that they will return to their home country. Their home country being the Taliban-controlled, gender apartheid rogue state of Afghanistan. So every time I feel genuine gratitude for my privilege, I think about the women that I work with in Afghanistan and other countries where that is absolutely not their reality. And I think that that's part of being global citizens. That's also part of why, even with all my criticism of the United Nations, that global governance predicated on peace and human rights is really the way forward for our planet. And one of the things about climate change and the research that has been done on the mitigation of damage is that it's typically women who lead at the local level and actually bring about measurable improvements.
Thank you for everything you do. Dr. Thiessen.
Like you, Rochelle, I'm an optimist, and I believe that good will overcome. It's going to happen.
Thank you.
For myself, I do believe that we can progress forward, but if recent events over the last few years have shown us anything, is that any and all of the things that we have fought to achieve can just as easily be taken away. And that's a very scary thing, and I think that instills a lot of anxiety and fear, especially in younger people. But that isn't to say that there isn't progress that can be made. I'm coming from an immense place of privilege, having experienced what it might be like what it was like to be a refugee, although I know that the experiences of refugees, the experiences of those around the world vary greatly, so even my own experience is privileged in many aspects. But in coming from that position of privilege, I understand that I do bear a responsibility to not isolate myself from the rest of the world and much of the work that has to be done. I mean, it's really scary right now with how much we're seeing things that took so many years to fight for and achieve be taken away so suddenly. And I think it's a very important reminder that the fight never really stops and we have a long way to go still. And I do believe part of the problem is that although we're progressing in the system, the very system itself needs changing. And the system is built on foundations that are unjust and really were founded on the suffering of others. So I think that we need to rethink like how we're governing everything and how the system is built, because yes, we're making progress, but that progress is being undone as we speak, and we're seeing that happen around the world. So I think it's a good time to live in now because we have many tools to combat that, and we have the benefits of social media and where information is rapidly shared, And I think that's wonderful. I think because we're so much more aware of the world, I think that we can take that responsibility and apply it forward and ensure that those things that we fought for, that the generations before me fought for hundreds of years, are actually maintained and are not being stripped away as we're watching happen around the world for women and children and really any people in marginalized communities.
You are such an inspiration. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Dr. Guilfoyle, last word over to you.
Thank you very much. Is the cup half full, is it half empty? I mean, I'm an optimist because pessimists are omniscient. They know everything, and it's not going to work. And so, I don't know everything. In fact, I know very little. But what I do know is that there are more educated people in the world in history. And the process of education is changing, I think, and some of the challenges of patriarchy are hopefully being blunted and changed so that we can see people fulfill their potential. Because the biggest thing in the world we have to do is to build capacity. Build capacity in individuals and systems to be focused on really the betterment of the world and the well-being of every individual. And I think, yes, I can look at the SDGs, the Social Development Goals, and look at our midterm report. And it's, shall we say, if you're at school, your mother will not be happy with the results. You're really, in general, getting, unfortunately, a failing grade. Although there are some high spots. Maybe you've got some good marks in some areas, but in general, the report is not. But that being said, this is our tool, is education. Education is not what's put into us. Education is what is inside us that we bring out and share and show. And that's what humanity has. It's our second nature to be part of the housing we are, but it's our first nature to be transparent, reflective, and to spend the currency of love, which really is the only currency worth spending in profusion and in great plenitude across this wonderful planet, fragile as it is, which supports us.
Those are amazing closing words. Thank you all for spending your Friday night with us. Thank you to David Newman and his co-founder of Roll, Dr. Kauser Ahmed, for bringing us all together. And thanks to our wonderful panelists. I hope that you enjoyed this conversation from these amazing individuals as much as I did. And thank you all for being here tonight. Go and have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.